It is a singular I. And if an I be single, hey, I mean, we're all looking at the same thing in the same direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Metaphorically, it works really well, doesn't it? I mean, if we recognize that there's just one being, one essence, one spirit, and tag, we're all it, that's a pretty single-eyed piece there, huh?
yeah, that sounds like a single-eyed Joe. No, that's anyway. Uh, that's a song we sing at the stadium.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
it's not single-eyed Joe though. Anyway, good morning. All right, good morning, everybody. You got Bruce, Rawles, and Lynn Johnson, and we're here reading Absence from Felicity by Dr. Kenneth Wapnick. And Bruce, would you please say what you said earlier about
Oh, sure. Yeah.
what we're doing?
We are reading, as you said, Absence from Felicity, the story of Helen Schucman and her scribing of A Course in Miracles by Kenneth Wapnick, Ph.D. And we are at page 31. We just finished the italicized quote, or actually the indented quote. And now we're ready to read right where you have queued up in the Zoom window that you're screen sharing, which is ready to go. Would you like to read, or would you like me to read?
Sure. Why don't you start reading while I change the name of the, not from Felicity,
You can fully will say.
I'm just putting the name in the title in the Zoom room.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so Ken continues his account of Heaven and Helen, the early years, in chapter 2, and he says, sometime passed in the autobiographical account, meaning there was a lapse in her continuous coverage apparently. And Helen's next mention of religion was in reference to an experience she had at the age of 12 when the family went to Europe. The last part of the trip was a visit to Lourdes, as not the ice cream parlor that we used to visit as a kid. I'm sure it must be a different one, spelled differently too. Pardon that silly aside. As Helen's mother was interested in seeing the famous shrine to the Blessed Virgin Mary, Helen was, in her own words, quote, deeply impressed, unquote, by the grotto piled high, and was with thrown away crutches and braces, and, quote, loved, unquote, the statue of the Blessed Virgin standing atop a large rock, which she could see from the balcony of her hotel bedroom. She even bought herself a rosary, a medal of Mary, and a bottle filled with the holy and healing water that flowed from the rock on which the statue stood. Helen and her mother went to mass at the grotto and stayed. And then, now it's quoting Helen here, for a beautiful service afterwards. It was Saturday, and there were even more flowers and music and processions than usual. People were praying everywhere. It was all very, very beautiful. I asked my mother if she'd ever been a Catholic, and she said no. But you could see that she was weakening. That's the end of Helen's quote there. Extremely moved by her experiences and tempted to believe in God again, Helen decided to make a deal with him. Standing on her balcony that evening, she told God that she would believe in him and his miracles and become a Catholic as well, as if he would send her a miracle. And then now he's quoting Helen again from her autobiography. Please, God, I said aloud, I know I'm not a Catholic, but if all of this is true, would you send a miracle so I can believe in you? I had already decided what the miracle should be. I would close my eyes and say 3 Hail Marys. Then if I saw a meteor in the sky, when I opened my eyes, that would be my miracle. When I opened my eyes, the sky was full of shooting stars. I watched in stunned silence and then whispered, it's my miracle. God really did send it. Look, oh look, it's my miracle.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
So to each according to their needs, right?
I guess so.
Some
Yeah.
people need demonstrations, and others just know that the reality beyond this alleged one is worth trusting, and everywhere in between.
Yeah. And just as a young girl, that faith and that's obviously what Jesus recognized in her right away. I mean, not that there was any sort of choosing going on, because it was already chosen long ago, but it's her nature that she really, really, really wanted to believe.
Mhm.
And I'm sure when she bought that rosary, she was ecstatic, because I remember reading a little bit before about how she watched, people doing, or her nanny doing the rosary, and I just know how that feeling is, of just that longing, and we all do that longing. Um, but to ask for a miracle and to open your eyes and see shooting stars, that has really got to have an effect. But we will read on.
Okay.
It looks like there's uh, any, anything else about this whole thing, before I'll read on.
Well, I mean, it's an example of, that we all engage in is level of confusion. We all think that if things happen or don't happen in the world of space and time, that those things that happen or don't happen have the power to make us happy, or to alter our peace, or amend it or abridge it, or shorten it in any way. And no, of course, says no. It's really a decision in the mind that has nothing to do with what's happening in the world of space and time and matter and energy and stuff, right? So
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and what a beautiful experience. And I can bet there's been a lot of us who had experiences as children that gave us that, insight into the truth and reality of what is. But as we're going to read, and I'll just read. Um, so continuing from Ken. Helen's joy and faith were short-lived, however. As the sky darkened again, she began to rationalize away her miracle. The tour guide had told them of the frequency of meteor showers this time of year. One can be easily fooled by this kind of thing, she reasoned. And finally, if the shooting stars were really God's doing, then he would have seen to it that she believed in his miracle, which she was fast beginning not to. Isn't that funny how quick the ego will take over whatever
uh,
experience and say, that never happened?
uh-huh.
And just that's something that it's something I do as meditation. Um, um, is I would just start focusing on miraculous experiences that I've had in my life, or times in my life when I felt connected to God. And I think about those times, and I bring them up in my consciousness, as this is real, and this really happened. And for some reason, that reinforcement of it, when the ego is telling me it's just your imagination, my own reinforcement of it brings it back to me. And then I can focus on the reality of my holiness. I can experience my holiness once again, where I experience holiness, because I can guarantee when she looked out that window and saw the shooting stars, she had an experience. And how quickly her little mind just turned it into, that never happened. So don't let that happen to you. And if you have these experiences, do hold on to them and remember them, because it may not be God telling you something. But it always is God telling you something. Everything is God telling you something. So believe it. When you get to the fork in the road, take it, as Yogi Berra would say. All right, so Helen continues on her experience. I had become deeply suspicious of the whole thing.
I think
I
I
even
think you
thought,
Lynn,
what?
I think you missed a paragraph. That if you back up a paragraph.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Helen's faith and joy were short-lived, however. As the sky darkened again, she began to rationalize away her miracle. The tour guide had told them of the frequency of meteor showers this time of year. One can be easily fooled by this kind of thing, she reasoned. And finally, if the shooting stars were really God's doing, then he would have seen to it that she believed in his miracle, which she was fast beginning not to. So right away, she's depending that, God's going to reinforce this for me. And, this is how the ego is very tricky. So So Helen continues, I had become deeply suspicious of the whole thing. I even got a little bit angry about it. Perhaps, I said to myself, the water and the healings and the crutches were all like the meteor shower. People just thought they were miracles. It could all happen that way. And so, what a reasonable person. Um, and Ken continues. On the other hand, Helen went on, the miracle did happen as she asked. And besides, what if God became angry at her for her ingratitude and disbelief? If there were a God, he might not. Okay, so apparently this is her saying, if there were a God, he might not like the way I was taking his miracle. Perhaps I'm not being appreciative. If God had taken the trouble to send me a miracle, especially for me, to send a miracle, especially for me, he might not take kindly to all this skepticism. And if there were a God, there might also be a hell for people who do not appreciate him. Oh my Lord, have you ever gone around like this? Round and around and around in your mind?
Sounds like an Old Testament conundrum, huh?
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's so hard. I'm so sad for children, but people don't think that kids have these experiences, but here is Helen Schucman, who was, basically just a normal girl living in New York City with her family, and she was having all these experiences. She was entranced by God. She was surrounded by thoughts of God. She was, even though her parents were not really specifically religious, she wanted God. She knew that that was something that was real. And her mother's ambivalence and her father's denial and all those things, you they all played into her ability to accept the miracles that she was experiencing. Um, and it's just it's for me, it's this is uh, a a, a kind of a sign. It's like a little playbook, that when something beautiful happens, do not allow the ego to overcome you and tell you that nothing happened. It's just crazy that way.
On the same note, it's easy for us to ascribe meaning to the physical attributes of what's always an inner experience, and forget that the inner experience is always the result of a choice of one of two thought systems and has nothing to do with what may have happened on the level of form, as much as we would like to ascribe it to that. But that's ego strategy all the time, is to make it about what happens or doesn't happen in the world, so that we, whether consciously or not, are always at the mercy of the world rather than it being a result of our thinking. And that's sometimes subtle but crucial difference, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a difference that we really don't know or don't recognize until we look at it. So this is why looking is so important. And how many times in the Course of Miracles does Jesus tell us to look? And yeah, we want to look at everything else. So it's myself I crucify. I'm the one who's making up the story.
Mhm.
All right, you want to read on?
Sure. Um, Unable to resolve her problem, which was rapidly assuming major proportions in her mind, Helen finally decided she did not need to make a decision right away. And there the matter of God, miracles, and the Catholic Church rested, so to speak. However, throughout her life, Helen never lost her fascination and attraction for Catholicism. Years later, she reflected on this period. When I had been younger, I used to drop into Catholic churches quite often. I was on friendly terms with the Blessed Virgin, but disregarded God entirely. I always went down the side of the church where her statue was. I liked the church and the candles, and especially the services devoted to the Blessed Virgin. I used to join the singing and bless myself and feel like everybody else. When I decided to be a great poet, see below, I bought myself a silver rosary and went to a Catholic church every day. I knelt down like everybody else and recited my rosary, but instead of saying the quote, Hail Marys, unquote, I said the name of a famous poet instead. When I decided to be a great painter, I used the names of great painters. In my role as a great singer, I recited names of operas on the beads. As for her mother and the experience at Lourdes, Helen wrote, my mother had changed her own religion again, but she did not discuss this much with me, and I did not like to raise the question myself. I still wore my medal of the Blessed Virgin, but I had not reached a definite conclusion about my miracle. I thought of it every once in a while, but always held off taking a firm stand. So, a lot of times we have, experiences where we get these little epiphanies or insights, and if we don't dismiss them completely, we usually kind of, you know, shelve them or put them in a metaphoric closet somewhere, and think, well, I'll get to that later. And
Yeah,
it's always the someday I'll excursion that we're sailing on.
oh yeah, and I mean, this is very typical of all of us in our situations, because think about it. How many times maybe in your life, I don't know if you have, definitely have, I've said, well, in my next life, when I'll do this, and I'll be, at some time in the future, life of some time, I will become enlightened. And I mean, I'm always thinking that I can put off for tomorrow what could be done today. And so I mean, it's typical, because you think that um, that you're not capable of doing whatever it is that you need to do to be worthy of uh, the truth now. And that it isn't so much of a burning, like a drowning man wanting air. um, it's just a wouldn't it be nice kind of situation. And so I think Helen fluctuated back and forth between that longing for air and uh, maybe I can do it later. It
Mhm.
seemed like throughout her life. So uh, but interesting. Okay, you want to continue reading or want me to read?
Go ahead.
Okay, so religion, however, once again reared its head about a year after the experience at Lourdes through the family maid, Georgia. Georgia and Helen had been close for some time, but their friendship deepened when the family moved to a smaller apartment after Helen's brother Adolf, 14 years her senior, married and moved out. Georgia came from Alabama and had no family in New York, so the Cones, and particularly Helen, became her family. Georgia was a deeply religious Baptist, and Helen developed a strong interest in her religion. So she's already, changes, looking at all the different churches. And so Helen says, her church thought hell was real, she told me, but I gathered that she herself believed in a God who was quite friendly and did not go around scaring people with hellfire and damnation. Besides, although he did not bother his children by making too many unreasonable demands on them, he did not let them down and arranged it so things always came out all right in the end. This sounded good enough to me. I was none too sure that everything would come out right myself. So Ken continues. Helen went to George's room every evening to read the Bible. It was a nice thing to do before going to bed, Helen observed. Then one Sunday, Georgia invited Helen to accompany her to church, and Helen could scarcely contain her excitement as they traveled way uptown together. Uh, I'm going for this. And Georgia said that God would be waiting for us, and she was usually right. Before the service, Georgia took me right up in front of the church and introduced me to the minister, who said, God bless you to me. Then Georgia and I sat down together and waited for the Lord. The people in Georgia's church sang songs that were very different from anything I had ever heard. They were simple and lovely little melodies. The people sang them over and over, beginning softly and getting louder and louder each time. It got so beautiful, you could burst into tears. A number of people did, but most of them began very happy and began to clap their hands and stamp their feet to the music. Some of them even stood up in their seats or went out into the aisles and began to shout. I could tell that they were feeling wonderful, even though I could not understand most of the words they were shouting. I was not sure if they were even speaking English. It was obvious, though, that they were on friendly terms with God and were accustomed to speaking to him this way. At first, I was surprised by all this. I had always addressed God formally and hardly with intimacy. I did not know what to make of this approach for a while, and even suspected it might be a mistake. But soon my feet began to tap with the music. A little later, I was clapping my hands, and still later, I was singing out loud just like everyone else. Georgia was swaying back and forth with her eyes closed, but every once in a while she would look toward me and smile. I was feeling happy and very much at home. Then the minister gave us a wonderful talk. He told us all about God and heaven and salvation. He said this world was not our real home and wonderful things were waiting for us. Someday, he said, we would all be with the Lord forever. All we needed was faith. Faith was the gift of God, and anyone who asked for it would be given it. We sang some more, and then everyone went outside to shake hands with the minister. When my turn came, he asked me how I liked the service, and I said it was just wonderful. He said I should come again and patted me on the shoulder. Now that I had been specially invited, I went to church with Georgia as often as possible. In the church, I prayed and sang with everybody else, but outside, when I tried to talk to God, I was never really sure anyone was there to listen. Something was missing. And finally, one day I found out what it was. Georgia took me one Sunday to a baptism service. People in long white robes stood at the side of a marble pool in front of the church. The minister, who was now a great friend of mine, stood in the pool and laid each of the people back into the water. Afterward, they walked out of the pool on the other side and joined the ranks of the redeemed. I was very much impressed. Before the ceremony, the minister had said, "Those who are to be baptized today have come to fulfill the wishes of the Lord himself. He has told us that we must be baptized to be saved. Unless you are baptized, you cannot be pure in heart. Unless you are pure in heart, you cannot see God." That's it, I thought to myself. You have to be baptized before you can see God. I had not been baptized. That was what was missing. Wow. Helen discussed this verse with Georgia, who fervently recommended this most wonderful experience of her life. She said, when you get baptized, the Spirit of the Lord descends on you and works a miracle in your heart. And afterwards, you have a big party. Baptism makes you a real child of God. After all, the Bible says you are supposed to be baptized. Georgia took the Bible and showed me the passage. That was what it said, all right. There was no doubt about it. Wow. Children, oh my goodness. So Ken continues. Helen made up her mind. She should be baptized. She spoke to the minister, who explained to her the baptized are expected to join the church. This presented a problem Helen had not foreseen. The minister suggested Helen give it some thought. Helen says, I went home and thought it over. Things were more complicated than I had realized. I had not expected that joining the church was part of being baptized, and I felt that one should be at least believe in God before taking a big step like that. Oh my goodness.
Interesting. I'm reflecting on the course's incredible openness. I mean, infinite openness, and it says you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe or understand anything that you're doing. You just have to try what it suggests and see if it works for you. Which is really kind of akin to, a pure scientific method is just, test it and see if it works.
Exactly.
See if it's consistent, and if it's not consistent, then it can't be true.
Yeah, it's funny. This story just is so funny to me because it reminds me, I was a Catholic kid, and they told us, and of course, that if you even step foot in another kind of church, that God would see it, Jesus would see it, and you could possibly go to hell for doing that. Yeah, it's pretty bad, pretty scary stuff. But then I had a babysitter who was some sort of evangelical, like this church sounding. And so she took me to her church. And, I'm glad to see Helen was delighted by all of the things that she saw. I was shocked and horrified. I cannot imagine people getting up in church and doing these things. This was like sacrilege to me because, Catholic Church used to be, now it's gotten a lot more, ecumenical and all that business. But it used to be the Catholic Church, you just go in there, you just sit down, you be quiet, you stand, you sit, you kneel, you stand, you sit, you kneel, you say all the prayers, you go up and take your communion, you go sit back in your seat, kneel, all I mean, that's everything like a formula there. Everything goes at a certain time and people say things at a certain time, so it's like all very calm. And if the choir sings that beautiful choir singing and you're not singing, nobody, nobody in the room was singing, just the choir. So, when she took me in that church and they started up with all that stuff, I was shocked. I was terrified. And I remember my mother had given me a dime to put in the when they passed around the basket because she knew that they would do that. And I'm like, I'm not giving my dime to this. I'm gonna buy me an ice cream cone, which I did. And I felt horribly guilty for a long time for stealing a dime from God. But that ice cream cone was at Dairy Queen, and you could actually buy a whole ice cream cone at Dairy Queen for a dime. So anyway, that's my story.
That's funny.
Oh my gosh. But it is crazy. I mean, that when she recognized that there was a bargain that had to be made, that you don't just get this grace by being baptized. Now you have to join the church. That she knew that was not right. She knew that was not what this God that she was thinking about would have asked her to do. So, but I think that's so funny that she says, and I felt that one should at least believe in God before taking a big step like that.
Yeah, and of course that's putting the cart before the horse in a sense is of course Miracles suggest that if you try the exercises and consider the ideas before it doesn't ask for belief at all. I mean, belief is not necessary. In fact, belief oftentimes gets us in trouble, but it's really the experience of the peace that is really the reinforcement for
Right,
its
exactly.
teaching. Yeah.
Because beliefs are not real.
Mhm.
Belief, as Dove always says, there's a big lie in the middle of them.
Yeah.
Beliefs are not real, and you can know that for yourself that I used to believe in Santa Claus, but I don't now. And as real as that belief may have been to me at the time, it's no longer valid at all because it's not true. So beliefs are just stories that we tell ourselves about things. And
And you forgot to have a disclaimer for kids to turn off the sound for a few seconds before you
I
said,
didn't say anything.
"Oh,
I just said I
Lynn."
used to believe. I just said I used to believe. I didn't go there. So kids are safe.
Oh, all us kids will now have to come
They
up with
don't.
another idol.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
I,
you
I
were.
thought I thought I might read a couple of the footnotes that I don't know if
Oh,
you're seeing them in the Kindle
please do,
edition.
because for me to go to the footnotes takes me completely in.
Yeah, from the last couple of pages, Ken puts referring to the Baptist singing and experiences. This would seem to have been the genesis of Helen's lifetime love of Negro spirituals. And then another one says Helen here was referring to the Pentecostal phenomenon of speaking in tongues, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit described in the New Testament. And that's on the bottom, page 34. Actually, going back a couple pages, there was, interestingly enough, in keeping with her aesthetic pose, oh, excuse me, atheistic pose, a whole different word, atheistic pose during graduate school, which will discuss below. Helen did not capitalize pronouns relating to God. Later on, however, she was very insistent about the use of capitals for most words associated with the divine. And he discusses that further on page 365. And then lastly, there's a footnote on the bottom of page 35, which we just read. One of Helen's very favorite Bible passages was from John's first letter, 3:2f. It says, "Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself even as he is pure. Anyway, so, and then he's got more comments on that later.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, basically, he was saying if you see the Christ in others, you'll see it in yourself. That's pretty cool.
yeah,
Jesus
yeah.
actually said that, yeah.
The core, like one of the core ideas in the course. Yeah.
Yeah, so perfect. So you want to read on?
Sure, sure. I have us on the top of page 36 in the print version. Helen also spoke to a Baptist minister near her home, but was told the same thing. He would be glad to baptize me and accept me as a church member. Those seemed to be the rules. However, Helen finally found a minister who held a special monthly baptism service, and he agreed to baptize the 13-year-old. He suggested, however, that perhaps it would be a good idea for Helen to ask her parents first, especially as her father was Jewish. Helen complied. Her mother was pleased and promised to buy Helen the pocketbook she had desired, while her father had no feeling whatsoever, other than he felt Helen should do what she wished. And so Helen returned to the minister and prepared to be baptized the following Sunday. And now Helen's account resumes here. Georgia came to my baptism as my witness and my friend. She helped me get ready and put on my white robe. She was very excited and kept telling me that I was going to have the most wonderful experience of my life. I hoped that she was right. After the ceremony, I got dressed and went to the minister's study to get my baptismal certificate while Georgia put my wet things in a bag that we had brought with us. On the way home, Georgia said we should have some sort of party, so she treated me to ice cream and cake and bought me a box of candy afterwards. I enjoyed the party, but when we got home, I began to feel sad. It was not really different now that I had been baptized. I went on going to church with Georgia a while longer just in case. Then I began to go only once in a while and finally just stopped altogether. There was no use. I did not have faith. Georgia said it was probably the work of the devil and suggested that I pray anyway. She also promised to pray for me. God would not let me down. She was sure now that I had been properly baptized. I was very fond of Georgia. She had been very kind to me. I thanked her for her prayers and let it go at that. And then Ken continues. I remember Helen's husband, Lewis pronounced Louis, once telling me how important a figure Georgia had been for Helen, since she was the one who, quote, had given Helen her religious foundation, unquote, and how much Helen had always loved her. Georgia remained with Helen and Louis, incidentally, until around 1970, when she had become almost blind and entered a nursing home. She and Helen remained in contact for a while after, and then Helen lost track of her old friend, one of the very, very few people in her life to whom she exhibited no ambivalence. Helen's young life seemed to deteriorate from this point. Her entering adolescence and ongoing weight problems suddenly assumed almost cosmic proportions. She became the butt of cruel jokes by her friends, and boys paid little or no attention to her. And then Helen says, I was pretty miserable and did what I always did when I was miserable. I ate. The more I ate, the fatter I got. I began to refuse all invitations and came home right after school and stayed there. I had not found God, and it was beginning to look as though I was not wanted much on earth either. Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I can really, really, really relate to that, because yes, when I was very thin as a child. When I became adolescent, uh, I went through that same kind of depressive thing, and I gained weight, uh, I always was very concerned about being fat. I have this real fat phobia. And I think that Helen kind of shared the same thing, is the idea that, somehow you have to look a certain way, or else you'll be rejected, like by by everybody. So it's really, I really can relate to how she was feeling, and that feeling of like disappointment that she didn't that having a baptism didn't change her life. It didn't make her feel loved. It didn't make her feel any better. Um, and in fact, it kind of made her miserable, because she recognized that all the belief that she had in what was going to happen, she was disappointed. And you know, that's kind of her relationship with God seems so far is, she's setting herself up to be disappointed, and then, not happy about, uh and then when she looks back, that's what happened. But this is a young girl. I mean, 13 years old. My goodness, I had thoughts about, I was very religious and had a lot of this kind of thoughts when I was 13 too, but that is not really typical at all. Having raised daughters and having granddaughters and having lots of young girls in my life, I have not met anyone who had that kind of religious desire or Helen, sh- this was the focus of her life from a very early age. And uh, I think it was all these things were formative to making the course what it is. Beautiful. You want me to read? Let's
Sure.
see. Okay. Helen's mother was supportive and tried to be helpful. She had by this time turned her religious interest to Christian Science, and so brought Helen to a most wonderful practitioner, one who had, quote, shown her the light. So here now is Helen's relationship or experience with Christian Science. She says, I needed a bit of light myself, so I agreed to try the practitioner. And she's 13, 14 years old, I don't know. I agreed to try the practitioner. My mother gave me a book to read first. It did not make much impression on me one way or the other, and I went to the practitioner more in desperation than in faith. The practitioner spoke a lot about God, gave me a lot of arguments with the glibness born of frequent repetition, but I could not help thinking that by her way of argument, you could prove just about anything. What a smart girl. I realized very soon that I was up against the same old problem with faith. You have to believe first and find proof afterwards. There was no point in going through all that again. Wow. So Ken continues. Eventually, without God's help, Helen slimmed down, although her weight was an ongoing problem and concern throughout her life. In her later years, Helen was successful in containing her weight, but at great expense of mental energy. She was constantly preoccupied with the invasion of extra calories into her system because of all her, quote, fat thoughts, unquote. I used to tease her about being the fattest thin person I ever knew. I've seen pictures of her, the fattest thin person I've ever knew.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is an eating disorder that a lot of young girls
Oh, sure. Yeah, very,
get into, and
very
I
commonplace, isn't it?
think girls because boys too, but
Yeah.
not as seriously because what happens in puberty is that things happen to your body that are not I mean, they're like unexpected. And when you start, gaining weight or whatever, it's uh, can be a real shock. And so a lot of young girls develop those eating disorders. And uh, so, yeah, I can understand it. My daughter just called me. I need to call her back real quick. So I'm going to mute myself and let you read.
Okay, I'll go on from where we left off. So Ken continues, in general, Helen's high school years and on into college were unhappy ones. Moreover, she decided at some point that she would make her mark in life by being a great writer. And then I'll read the footnote that Ken has at the bottom of page 38 here. Helen, at other times, as mentioned above, also considered careers as a world-famous painter and opera singer. Her singing teacher was even able to arrange an audition for a radio program, yet Helen developed laryngitis, quote, which lasted so long that my singing career somehow got laid aside permanently, quote. So Ken continues. Yet there was a serious problem in Helen's writing aspirations, her great fear of putting words down on paper. And then here's Helen's account. I had no doubt that someday I would be a great writer, probably an internationally famous novelist. I would live by myself and write. In view of my secret goal, the intense difficulty I had in writing anything at all was particularly hard to cope with. Further, I was so sensitive about anything I wrote that even when I finally succeeded in getting something down on paper, I was likely to refuse to hand it in. It was difficult to deny that this was not in keeping with my future career as I envisioned it. I finally managed, though shakily, to work it into my role as an intellectual and a great writer to be, although I was never too comfortable with it. As an intellectual, I was hypercritical, and as a writer, I was super sensitive. Someday these attributes would add to my eminence, even though they were hard to handle at present. And then Ken continues, in light of Helen's later conflict over scribing A Course in Miracles, her early difficulties in writing assumed greater interest. While Helen was taking down the course, Jesus explained this to her. And here's a quote from some of the channelings, not from the course, but from the personal material that Jesus was giving to Helen. Your earlier acute problem in writing things down came from a much, emphasized much earlier, i.e. in a past life, Ken puts in brackets, misuse of very great scribal abilities. These were turned to secret rather than shared advantage, depriving the ability of its miraculous potential and diverting it to possession. Well, there's even though it's just meant for Helen's use, this quote really applies to all of us, is that, shared interests transcend the insanity of separate interests. And that's pretty obvious. And so Helen was overcoming her self-consciousness by quote unquote channeling Jesus, and recognizing that the self-consciousness disappears, as I've discovered in myself too, when I'm sharing something that I feel is true, which means I'm allowing it to come through me rather than from me. So Ken says more of this later, but to continue now with Helen's autobiography. And then Helen continues. Meanwhile, I read a lot of philosophy. Plato was always a favorite of Helen. Ken write some brackets here, and became happily involved in systems of thought in general and logic in particular. Here at last was surety of a kind. Whatever might happen in an uncertain world, one could go safely from given premises to the proper conclusions. I love logic and math and anything that gave me the feeling of being a nice, tight, closed system. This I felt I could cope with. I almost had a fit the first time I ran up against inductive math. I felt betrayed by my best friend. I majored in philosophy, which offered excellent opportunities for arguing on both sides of practically any question. And I had a very good time. Ken puts in brackets the word thus. I played around with syllogisms for years and loved them, but to the business of living, I paid as little attention as possible. And I'm kind of grinning and chuckling in that I have had and still continued somewhat an interest in what's becoming known as sacred geometry. And if you go to geometrycode.com, I still try to post something of interest at least once a month there. And people occasionally send me books to read and articles to review and that sort of thing. And I try to share what I find helpful and interesting with the readers of that website. And I have a couple of books that are one being about almost all patterns of geometric forms, which I'm, in hindsight now, see that it was my interest in trying to find something stable in a mathematical, or in this case, geometrical archetypes that would lead me to an unchanging awareness. But I, learned over the years that, the forms might at best point to that awareness, but they're not the cause of it. They can be a reflection seen properly of that understanding, but they certainly have no causative power of their own. So I can certainly relate to Helen's wanting to find something that's stable and unchanging, something that's certain. So I enjoyed logic and math too. So I can relate to Helen's story there. So are you back from your conversation, Lynn? Maybe not.
Yeah, it's interesting. uh, that she did all those things because this is something I didn't remember about Helen, that she
I
loved math, and I mean, news to me.
Yeah, I read the whole book, but I kind of forgot about this too. Yeah, it's a lot of this is sort of like reading it for the first time again, only because it's been so long.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely for me, because lots of water under the bridge since this.
Yeah, and of course, every time I pick up the course, there not only is there so much in it, but uh, we all have so much resistance to it. It would seem, as a generalization, that it's almost like reading it anew each time we read it with fresh eyes and a fresh mind, and realize, oh yeah, there's still a whole lot more to apply here, and I'm still working on making the Holy Spirit's thought system the predominant one and the default rather than the ego. So that's why we need a lot of repetition. And so reading inspiring things again is not only a good idea, uh, but as Art and Persa, Gary Renard's teachers say, it's essential. We have to keep at it until um, it kicks in and we decide voluntarily that that's what we want to be as our default, right?
Exactly. And it just over and over and over and over, it does kind of wears a groove into you, whereas the ego is already, worn the Grand Canyon, but
Yeah, yeah. We've got a little groove in the driveway compared to the ego's Grand Canyon. So the course attempts to reverse that, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And
Reverse
it
habit.
can't be the miracle. The miracle is, there is no Grand Canyon. Ha ha.
Exactly.
There's a grander universe that you are oblivious to because of this little world that you choose to look at. It just
Hmm.
cracks me up. All right.
I could see the Grand Canyon in the distance when I flew back from Arizona not too many weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
Going to be
And,
driving, not too close to there, but back into Arizona
oh,
on Friday. So that's
oh my gosh, you're gonna love.
hopefully I will be unpacked enough to do another session Saturday morning. But if not, you might want to queue up something to
Oh, I
tide us
can
over until the following Saturday. So,
channel. You
yeah,
can just go to our YouTube channel and play something.
there you go. There you go.
I
Yeah.
love it.
I'll let you know. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll read on. Um, Helen's fascination with logic successfully filled her need to manipulate form without paying particular attention to the underlying meaning or content of her fear relating to the world. She loved, for example, the idea that one can logically prove anything, whether true or false. And she must have went to school with Jesuits, because man, that's all they do is logic, logic, logic. Okay, once one accepts a beginning premise, this dynamic, quote, form at the expense of content, unquote, was a major component in Helen's massive defensive system against the meaning of God, and was characteristic of her entire life. It is interesting to note, as will be described more fully later on, how in A Course in Miracles, Jesus made use of Helen's syllogistic skills, but shifted the underlying content from Helen's fear to his love. And boy, I can attest to that.
Yep.
Jesus's logic in A Course in Miracles is impeccable.
And brilliant. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that is because Helen's mind was trained to logic.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
is wow, what a gift. I mean, she's just, given so many but beautiful gifts by her own personal being. And
Hmm.
so it's beautiful. So continuing on, while a sophomore at New York University, Helen met Louis Schucman, who was a senior working in the library. One of their early encounters involved Helen's pleading with Louis to allow her to keep a reserved book an extra day, as she had not yet completed her class assignment. Louis refused at first, strict librarian, but eventually succumbed to Helen's charms and promises to have the book back promptly. Helen took the book with full intentions of returning it as promised. But while reading it next to an open window, the book, quote unquote, flew out of her hands in a most inaccessible alleyway, into a most inaccessible alleyway. She very sheepishly had to inform Louis of what had happened. But despite the fiasco of trying to retrieve the book, and he said, I believe they eventually did so, they became good friends, finding in each other a suitable partner. Intellectuals, somewhat uncomfortable with the opposite sex, and in fact with the whole business of living. Louis proposed to Helen 3 months later. Helen's father particularly had no opinion on the subject. As he said to Helen, he hardly knew the young man. I think her dad must have just been really not there. Helen's mother, on the other hand, while having some reservations, since Louis was Jewish, nonetheless was enthusiastic in large part because she was afraid Helen would never receive another proposal.
Oh gosh. I'm just thinking about this symbolism, the ambivalent father. It's like, well, as the course reminds us, that God takes no particular interest or cognizance of the world, because that would basically be our doom if that were so. If perfect oneness meddled in duality, then it wouldn't be perfect oneness anymore, and then we'd have nothing to go home to.
Wow.
No,
Wow.
nothing, nowhere to awaken to, returning from the dream that we made up. Huh?
That is really interesting. That is really interesting. Yeah. Her father didn't know what was going on in her life.
Yeah.
That's
Now, on the level of form, that one could consider that, rudeness or callousness or whatever, but metaphorically, I think it's kind of like, wow, what a saving grace.
yeah, it's beautiful. Wow. So Helen says, my mother asked me if I were sure he was really the right one. And I said I was, not really knowing what else to say. Then my mother kissed me and began to arrange for a party. And so it seemed we were engaged. Oh my goodness. So Helen and Louis were married a few months afterwards on May 26, 1933, in a short ceremony held to please Louis's parents in a Reformed rabbi's office. Shortly before the wedding, Helen did a characteristic thing. The Sunday before this is her writing, the Sunday before we were married, Georgia made a special consecration for us, and I really appreciated it. I was quite uneasy about the marriage. I went for a thoughtful walk the afternoon before the ceremony, and what with one thing and another, I stopped off at a Catholic church. I did not say any prayers, but I lit 2 candles, one for my future husband and one for me. It seemed like a good thing to do. That's beautiful. She went and lit candles for her and Louis. So the ceremony was over within 10 minutes, seemingly to everyone's relief. And then, and then Helen and Louis returned to their respective parents' homes to study for final exams.
That's
Here's
funny.
our honeymoon. We're studying for our finals.
Mm-hmm.
Many years later, Helen described the wedding in a letter to Bill. Um, she says, we had a horrible wedding. I claim I wasn't there. And my brother yelled at me, and my mother said she hoped everything would come out all right, even though Jonathan, which is what she called Louis, was a Russian Jew. My father came to the wedding, of course, but he really wasn't there. Fortunately, I had to study for an exam, and so did Jonathan. So the whole thing blew over quietly. Oh my goodness. So Ken continues. Louis graduated that spring and went into the book business, his love, while Helen still had 2 years of school to complete. They lived at first with Helen's parents as they had no money. The state of being married seemed to have little or no effect on either of them. Shortly after Helen's college graduation, her mother became very ill. The doctor suggested she be relieved of all household responsibility, and so Helen's parents moved to a hotel, while Helen and Louis took a small apartment nearby. Georgia was no longer needed by the Cohns, but they felt responsible for her, as she was, what, quote, virtually a member of the family, unquote. Since Helen and Louis could not afford a maid, and Helen was totally unable to run a household, Helen's parents continued to pay Georgia's salary so she could work for Helen and Louis. I was very grateful about this decision. I did not know how to cook, and Georgia was a very old friend, and it was nice to have her around. It just amazing to me that I
Mhm.
mean, just amazing to me. To be so cool, unprepared for life completely, just in the most fundamental ways. Uh, it's just, you know, she was a mystic and not meant to be a cook, I guess. So, let's see. Do you want to read on? Oh no,
Sure.
look what time it is.
Well, actually, I think we've only got
Let's just finish this last little bit.
3.5 pages. But
You got 2 minutes.
two minutes out. Yeah, okay. Helen's marriage to Louis triggered deep-seated insecurities that manifested in excessive and obsessive concerns about his health. And she once again returned to the magic the Catholic Church offered her. And now she quotes, "Now, in order to protect Louis from illness, disaster, and sudden death, I began going to the Catholic Church again. This time it became a real prison. I had to go to Mass every day and to special services in the evening. I made novenas all the time. I recited prayers over and over and had to make sure that each one was said exactly as given in the prayer book. I said prayers all day long. Louis is Jewish. He is not religious, but has a sincere interest in Jewish things. He didn't like my going to church all the time, but he didn't interfere." Helen, and then Ken comments, "Helen later told me that Louis' constant fear was that he would wake up in the morning to find out that Helen had been baptized a Roman Catholic." Well, that's probably a good place to stop for today.
That's a good place to start. Oh my
Yeah, yeah,
God, what
yeah.
a horrific thing to happen, to wake up in the morning and find out your wife is a Catholic. I love it. I love it.
Sounds like one
Oh,
of those things that you may be a Catholic if, and then there's a list of
yeah.
bullet points, right?
Oh, how funny. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bruce Rawles. And we will
Likewise, Lynn Johnson.
be continuing on with The Absence from Felicity by Dr.
Yeah, either next week or the following week for me anyway. And I look forward to our next conversation as always.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. I love you, brother.
Likewise.